Snowmelt water ran cold across the ruts of the main street, thin as a blade, reflecting a sky the color of old tin. She stood beside the freighting office with her shawl drawn high, cheek turned from the world, though the world would not quit staring. The scars lifted and puckered like creek beds in drought, a ruin from ear to jaw where fire had kissed and held on. She kept her eyes low, watching a nail head glitter in the plank step as if it were a star that had fallen only for her. A team clattered by, iron shoes striking sparks, and the men on the buckboard let a laugh run down. Not loud, not crude, but easy, like spitting. She felt the laugh lodge inside her, a burr in the throat. The freighting agent read out names and line items with no more feeling than a clock. She had come to sell a small parcel, thread and a tin crucifix left from the house, but his eyes traveled her face and then skittered away. She felt the old ache, a head pain that gathered behind the good temple, and for a moment the street swam. If she fell here, she would not be lifted. She knew that much. The town had taken its measure of her and found it suitable for looking through. Wind came along carrying the smell of wet sage and the low, rich musk of horses. She held to that smell as to a rope. Once, she had braided her hair long enough to touch her spine. Once, she had a bed made by his hands, posts polished smooth as river stones. Once, fire had unmade everything that hands could build. She felt the ash inside her, drifting still. From the far end of the street, the auctioneer was warming his voice, calling for a mare with hip bones like shelves. Folks turned that way, leaving the space near her empty, as if the ground itself had burned. She breathed slow, counted the heartbeats, and fixed her gaze again on the fallen nail star. The memory rose in her like smoke that would not clear. She had been 30 when the blaze took the house. It was an early autumn night, the wheat cut and stacked, and the air smelled of straw and whiskey. Her husband, Samuel, had gone down to the river for a barrel of water. He said the lamp was unsteady. He'd fetch the bucket. He'd be right back. But he never came. The lamp tipped. The flame caught. She remembered the baby's cradle burning white as heaven, and herself running through, hair burning, skin turning to paper. When the neighbors found her, she was crawling out the back like something born of fire. Not woman, but cinder. In the weeks that followed, she buried the child in a small wooden box, and the men who dug the grave kept their hats on, not in reverence, but in weather. She recalled the priest's voice trembling with the cold, his hands red and cracked. People had offered pity then, brief and polite. But pity, she learned, curdled faster than milk. Soon enough came whispers how Samuel had gone missing that same night, how maybe he'd started the fire himself. No one knew. No one cared much either. She became a tale to tell by lantern light, a moral of some kind. Folks never agreed which one. After that she drifted, took work mending clothes at the edge of towns that would not claim her, slept in sheds, in barns, once under a bridge where ice hung like teeth. The scars healed wrong and tight. The pain lived in her jaw and sometimes climbed her skull in flashes of white. But she kept moving west, as though distance could trade sorrow for silence. She reached this town, a hard-scrabble place of mud, mules, and men who drank too hard, and thought perhaps here she might stop, if only to rest her feet. Now, as the auctioneer's cry broke the day, she wondered if maybe God had left her to wander so she could learn what it meant to live without witness. If this tale carried weight in your soul, subscribe, and let the weight be shared. The auction had drawn a crowd that moved like weather, restless, shifting, murmurous. She lingered near the edge, the hem of her skirt brushing damp dust. Men raised gloved hands, coins clinked, and a mare's white breath hung in the cold air like a soul waiting for permission. That was when she noticed him. He stood a little apart from the others, hat brim shadowing his face, coat rough and work-worn. There was something still about him, the way a mountain can be still solid, indifferent, yet full of quiet life. He looked not at the animals, but at the people around him, as if measuring the truth of them. When his gaze came to her, she almost turned away. Instead, she met it, braced, as if for a blow. He did not look startled, nor did he pity. There was only a small nod, a slow acknowledgement, like two travelers recognizing the same hard road. Then he turned back to the auctioneer, bidding low and winning a chestnut gelding for $1. When the sale ended, he crossed the space between them, boots leaving shallow prints in the thawing mud. She felt her pulse quicken, though she had learned long ago not to expect kindness from strangers. He stopped a pace away. "Ma'am," he said, voice deep as creek gravel. "Name's Elias. I got a place east of the ridge. Need help keeping it." She studied him. "You offering charity?" He shook his head once. "Work. Pays fair if you can sew, cook, and stand the wind." The words came hard in her mouth. "I've stood worse." He looked at her then fully, plainly, and for a heartbeat she forgot to hide. "I don't doubt it," he said. "You've the look of someone who's still here after the fire's gone." It struck her like a benediction, soft but startling. For the first time in years, she did not feel the need to flinch. When he turned to go, he tipped his hat and left her with a line of prints leading into the pale horizon. The sound of his horse faded, leaving only the whisper of wind in the sage. She went to him 2 days later, walking the long miles east through sleet and thawing ruts, her bundle tied in a flour sack. The land opened wide and bare, the color of pewter and dust. Cottonwoods leaned crooked beside the river like old men losing patience. When at last she saw the ranch, it stood alone against a rise, one small house, a barn stooped from years, and smoke lifting thinly from a stovepipe. Elias met her at the gate. He said nothing at first, only took her sack and set it down near the porch. His hands were large, scarred at the knuckles, yet moved with the same quiet care as someone handling something breakable. He showed her the kitchen, the lean-to where she might sleep, the corral where 3 horses nosed at the cold rails. The house smelled of wood smoke and old leather. They worked together that evening without much talk. She mended a torn saddle strap while he split kindling. The silence between them was not empty. It was shaped like a bowl holding something unseen. At supper, he poured her coffee thick as syrup, and they sat across the table, eating beans that steamed in the chill air. He told her little at first, only that his wife had died 5 winters past, and the land had gone quiet since. The fields needed tending, the roof leaked, and the nights had grown long enough to make a man forget his own voice. She listened, the lamplight trembling over her scarred cheek. "Seems we both been burned," she said softly. He looked up. "Ain't the fire that ruins a person?" he said. "It's thinking there ain't nothing left to build." The words lingered between them, slow and heavy as snowflakes. She felt something shift inside her, something small, like a door unlatched. For the first time in many months, she slept without waking to the smell of smoke. Outside, the wind moved across the plains, carrying faint traces of thaw and ash, as if the land itself remembered what they were trying to forget. Spring came lean and reluctant, with wind that still carried the scent of frost. Days grew longer, though light meant more work than rest. They repaired fences bowed by snow, dug irrigation ditches until their hands bled, and shared bread baked hard as stone. He taught her to harness the team and to read the sky for storms. She learned to listen for the small sounds that meant the land was alive again, the whistle of meadowlarks, the creek's slow breathing beneath the thaw. In those weeks, she grew strong again, her arms steadying, her back remembering labor. At night, when the fire was low, she would sew by lamplight while he read from a Bible with no cover. He never pressed questions about her past, and she never asked about the wife buried up the hill. Silence became their truest language. Sometimes, when she looked at him, she caught glimpses of the man beneath his quiet, something raw and lonesome. He carried a sadness that had no sound, the kind that lingered even when laughter dared its way in. Once, he told her how his father had died in a mining camp, leaving him a rusted watch and a debt he could not pay. "Spent half my life trying to make the land owe me nothing," he said, "still waiting on it to pay me back." She smiled faintly, thread glinting in her hands. "Maybe that's not how it works. Maybe you just keep it alive, and that's enough." He looked at her across the light. "And who keeps you alive?" She hesitated, her fingers freezing mid-stitch. "I ain't sure yet," she whispered. A storm came that night, rain beating the roof like fists. She lay awake, listening to its fury, and thought of the old fire again, but this time she did not shake. She felt, instead, a strange warmth beneath the fear, the slow dawning of something she dared not name. In the morning, the land smelled of wet earth and promise. He was already outside, mending a fence post, and when she stepped onto the porch, he turned, smiled small, and said, "Coffee's hot." By midsummer the valley lay gold and humming, the fields stretching like a hymn beneath the sun. Life had folded itself into small rituals: the hiss of coffee in the morning, the slow rhythm of work, the quiet laughter that began to appear between them like wildflowers after rain. She found herself watching him when he did not see how he spoke to the horses low and even, how he paused at the ridge each dusk to study the clouds. His steadiness soothed the wild, broken place inside her, though she still caught herself flinching when the stove popped or the wind rose hard against the windows. He never mentioned it, only moved closer, his presence steadying her as a wall in a storm. One evening he brought a mirror from town. He set it on the kitchen table, its glass clouded with age. "Figured you might want one," he said. She stared at it, heart thudding. It had been years since she'd looked full upon her own reflection. The sight of her face startled her, the pale stretch of scar, the hollows time had carved. She felt shame rise like heat. He saw it. "You don't have to turn away," he said quietly. "You're beautiful." The words struck her harder than cruelty ever had. She could not speak. He reached into his pocket and drew out a single silver coin, old and worn smooth. "Paid $1 for this glass," he said. "Best bargain I ever made." She turned from the mirror, eyes wet though no tears fell. "You're a fool," she whispered. "Likely so," he answered, "but it's a good kind of foolish." From then, something changed between them. Their hands brushed more often. He lingered near when she worked, offering a tool or a word. At night, their silences grew heavier, filled with the breathless space of things not yet spoken. Still, the world beyond their fence was not blind. Whispers from town began to travel like dust talk of the scarred widow living with a rancher, of sin cloaked as mercy. Some women turned their faces when she passed on supply days. The weight of that scorn pressed old wounds open again, and one morning, when she went to harness the team, she found the stable door painted over in crude words, "Burnt Witch." She stood before the slur, frozen. The paint dripped black against the pale boards, fresh and ugly. The horses snorted inside, restless at her stillness. She touched the word once, feeling its wetness, its hate, and then wiped her hand clean against her skirt. Her breath came shallow. The air itself seemed to harden around her. When Elias came from the field, she did not speak at first. He saw the mark, his jaw tightening, the muscle near his temple jumping like a pulse. He took a rag from his pocket and began to scrub without a word. The paint smeared into streaks, dark as blood. She moved beside him and took another cloth. Together they worked until their hands were raw, until only faint shadows of the letters remained. When it was done, she leaned against the wall, dizzy with anger and shame. "They'll never let me be," she said, "no matter how far I run." Elias dropped the rag, turned to her. "Then let 'em talk. Words don't raise fences, and they don't plow fields. You belong here same as I do." Her voice broke. "You don't know what it's like to be looked at and never seen." He stepped closer, the dust of work still on his shoulders. "Maybe not your way, but I know what it is to be left behind, to wake up and find the world's gone quiet around you." For a long while she said nothing. The wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the sound of the creek. Then she reached for his hand. It was a simple act, quiet but certain. He closed his fingers over hers, rough palm against scarred skin, and something in both of them eased. Later, they rode into town together, shoulders squared. The same faces watched, the same whispers stirred, but this time she did not lower her eyes. Elias nodded to the blacksmith, bought a coil of wire and 2 bolts of cloth, paid with calm hands. As they turned to leave, the preacher's wife called after them, voice sharp as sleet. "You think the Lord don't see what you've done?" Elias looked back, steady and unflinching. "He sees," he said, "and he's merciful." The words hung there, a quiet bell against the noise. Autumn came early that year, sharp-edged and golden, the kind of season that makes everything feel both alive and near its ending. The hills were the color of rusted coins, and the nights sank quickly into cold. They worked by lantern light now, gathering what the soil had managed to give. Sometimes, as they loaded the last of the corn, their shoulders brushed, and the touch carried a charge that neither had words for. But peace never lasts long on the prairie. One morning Elias received a letter sealed in red wax. He read it at the table, brow furrowing. When she asked, he hesitated. "It's from my wife's brother," he said at last. "He's coming out to claim her share of the land. Says the deed wasn't clean when she passed." The words struck her like a cold wind. She'd known something in him was unfinished, some sorrow still bound to the grave on the hill. But this threatened everything they'd built. The brother arrived 3 days later, all boots and law talk, his coat smelling of city tobacco. He looked her over once and sneered. "So this is the woman they whisper about, the one hiding out here like a coyote." Elias stepped forward, voice calm but iron beneath. "You'll watch your words under my roof." But the man only smirked. "Roof won't be yours long. Half of this land belongs to my blood." What followed were weeks of uneasy quiet, letters to lawyers, rides into town, nights when neither of them slept. She could feel Elias withdrawing, burdened by shame that wasn't his to bear. Once she found him at the gravesite, hat in hand, whispering apologies to the wind. "Elias," she said softly, "you can't make peace with the dead if you won't live with the living." He looked at her, eyes weary. "I just don't want you paying for what ain't your fault." "I already have," she said, "and I'm still here." He reached for her then, hand trembling, and she let him. The simple joining of their fingers was both promise and defiance. The next morning they rode into town side by side to face the brother, the lawyer, and whatever reckoning waited. The hearing was held in the back of the mercantile, where the clerk's desk served as both altar and gallows. Dust floated through the air like forgotten prayers. Elias stood tall beside her, hat in hand, while the brother lounged near the stove, with the look of a man already sure of his victory. The lawyer, a thin fellow with spectacles too small for his face, cleared his throat and spread out papers that smelled of ink and arrogance. "By right of blood," he said, "half the property in question belongs to the estate of Mrs. Halloran, deceased. Since no formal division was ever made, her kin," he nodded toward the smirking man, "maintains a legal claim." Elias listened, jaw set, saying nothing. The clerk, who doubled as the town's only witness to law, looked uncomfortable, his fingers worrying a pencil smooth. Then she spoke. Her voice came steady, low but firm. "You speak of law like it's clean," she said, "but there's more to claiming land than ink and blood. There's years of work, hands cracked open by the plow, nights patching roofs so the rain don't find the bed. You want to talk about what's owed, then reckon with that." The room went quiet. Even the stove seemed to pause its hum. The lawyer frowned. "Madam, the law is not moved by sentiment." She stepped closer, the lamplight catching the scars along her jaw. "Then maybe the law ought to learn a little sentiment, or else it ain't fit for the living." Something in her words struck the clerk. He cleared his throat, shuffled the papers, and said, "Seems to me this here claim's past its time. No signatures, no witnesses, and 5 winters gone. The land stays with the man who's kept it." The brother rose, face red, spitting curses that sounded small against the quiet. Elias simply said, "You'll find the road easy going out." When they stepped into the street, the wind had changed. The sky was high and pale, the smell of snow far off. She stood beside him, hands shaking from the release of it all. He turned to her, searching her face. "You saved this place," he said. She shook her head. "We saved each other." He smiled then, slow and full. "Reckon I ought to make that official." Winter settled, soft but certain, the snow smoothing every rough edge of the land. The cabin glowed against the whiteness like a heartbeat in the dark. Inside, the fire cracked and hummed, and she stood by the window watching flakes drift in the lantern light. Behind her, Elias moved slow and careful, setting a small box on the table. He opened it without words. Inside lay 2 simple rings, made not of gold but of iron, black and plain. "Couldn't afford more," he said, voice quiet. "But iron holds." She touched one with trembling fingers. The metal was cool, but there was warmth in the offering, steady as breath. "Iron don't shine much," she murmured. "No," he said, "but it lasts." They married in the kitchen 2 days later, the preacher from town riding through snow just to speak the words. She wore her one clean dress, faded blue, and he wore the same coat he'd worked in for years. When the vows were done, Elias kissed her forehead and whispered, "You're home now." After the preacher left, the night grew deep and still. They sat side by side before the fire, their hands entwined. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, whistling through the fence wires like a hymn. For the first time since the fire years ago, she felt the world no longer turning away from her. In spring, they would plant again. He'd build a new barn, and she'd fill the house with light, with music if they could find it. Maybe even a cradle someday, if grace allowed. But for now, they simply breathed in time with the crackle of flame and the soft creak of settling wood. She looked at him and thought how strange it was that after all the ruin, beauty could still come in such quiet forms. Not through miracles, but through hands that refused to let go. Elias turned, his eyes steady on hers. "We'll be all right," he said, and she believed him. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering their footprints, as if the world itself were giving them a clean beginning. Do not let this be the end. Subscribe and witness the beginning that follows.